So, let's start in a second. Okay, I think we should start now. Welcome to the conference. I'm very happy we have now 10 days to share our ideas and engage in psychology of global crisis. It's wonderful, so many people around the world are participating. I'm Ernst Schraube from Roskilde University, sitting in my study at home in Copenhagen. I'm the moderator of this session, and I want to introduce the keynote speakers, Veronica Hopner and Darrin Hodgetts. Both are from Massey University in New Zealand. They are part of a very important psychological tradition of thought engaged in developing a social psychology of everyday life, where the local and global problems and crises are in the center of research. In their talk, they focus on the implications of the corona crisis on people's conduct of everyday life in New Zealand. The title of the talk is Reflections on the Psychological Contract in Everyday Life Disrupted by Crisis. They will talk around 45 minutes, and then we have around 25 minutes for discussion. Now we are moving to New Zealand. Veronica and Darrin, thanks very much for joining in. We are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, and where is it? Where is it? On the desktop. Go there. Pull that up. Hi, everybody. Sorry, we're just adjusting ourselves here as we get started. Thanks, Ernst, for that kind introduction, and kia ora koutou. Welcome, everybody. What we'd like to do is just begin by thanking the conference organisers for bringing us together in such trying times and all their hard work in organising this event. We're really happy to be here, and we're also very excited about the talks that are going to occur during the conference. With so much going on, what we've decided to do is draw on some of the work that we've been doing collaboratively within our interdisciplinary Psycurity Research Cluster. This work's particularly important in the current situation. And also when we think about when we pause and reflect on what is going on in times of crisis, conceptual frameworks for understanding the dynamics of play become really crucial. As such, what we want to offer is our preliminary thoughts on what we initially called in our abstract the Spychological Contract, because we were primarily interested with issues around surveillance and privacy. We've actually changed that term a little bit to the Psycurity Contract to reflect our broader focus today. Now, we'll use this framework to explore some of the security issues and the dynamics at play in our society's response to the COVID-19 crisis. And this is an attempt to conceptualize the dynamic interplay of key tensions and elements in what we're calling the Psycurity Contract, which determines what's permissible in terms of actions to address the pandemic. And we also want to keep in mind that this contract is in a constant state of becoming as the crisis evolves. Just to set the scene a little bit more, I think what we'll do is start with a little bit of context around pandemics and the issue of risk.
Developments such as the increasing global interdependence of societies and uncertainties in the current epoch have enhanced public awareness and concerns regarding risks. In considering the current situation, we must take heed of Beck's reminder that from the start, risks are not always shared equitably, with some groups carrying a much heavier burden than others. As such, experiences of risk are often contingent on various intersections of place, culture, class, gender, religion, age, health, political affiliation, and sexual politics. Our focus here today is on the derivative tensions and the balancings of risks associated with material efforts that we're going to talk about to promote public safety. We are particularly interested in the trade-offs that are occurring around the use of risk mitigating practices, including heightened surveillance and lockdowns in relation to issues of privacy and freedoms of both movement and association. Before conceptualizing this contract, it is useful to spend a little bit more time on tensions in times of crisis. It is worth mentioning here that medicine traditionally occupies an interesting position in relation to issues of risk, security, surveillance, and privacy. Bagura and colleagues argue that medicine involves a social contract within societies that is largely implicit. Global health threats such as COVID-19 raise tensions around security and how population controls to ensure public health should operate. We know from pandemic threats like Ebola and associated cases such as Casey Hickox, who you can see on your screen, in 2014, that this contract can be highly contested and resisted by some individuals. Hickox was a licensed nurse who returned to the US after a month working with Ebola patients in Sierra Leone for Medicines Sans Frontières. She declared her recent contact with Ebola patients upon arrival at the New Jersey airport, and after lengthy questioning, was placed in the airport CDC quarantine facility. Despite assuring officials that she was asymptomatic and had in fact strictly adhered to protocols in Sierra Leone, Hickox was detained and then escorted home by state troopers. The state of Maine then petitioned for severe restrictions on Hickox's freedom of movement and association. Hickox immediately contested these restrictions and raised issues of procedural justice about the surveillance of her health and her loss of freedoms. She argued that due process was not followed because there had been no hearing to assess if the severe restrictions on her liberty were in fact necessary for public safety. The adjudicating judge found Hickox's surveillance and detention was not lawful. This case highlights the role of fear and trade-offs around human rights and actions to mitigate risk and ensure public safety, and in this case, public health. The same arguments posed by Hickox have also been made in this country in a failed attempt to sue our Prime Minister over the lockdown. Most others have questioned the legality of such measures, or many others, I should say. In terms of the Psycurity Contract, we will outline that these cases show the importance of state interventions being procedurally just to minimise contestation and breaches of social contracts in times of crisis. Such legal challenges also highlight the dynamics of what we term the Psycurity Contract, as they result in changes to government containment and eradication strategies. In this country, they have sparked judicial, governmental, and public deliberations in regarding what procedures are appropriate in response to COVID-19 to ensure public security and where the balance should lie in the suspensions of rights. So these cases illustrate the complex functioning of the Psycurity Contract and of the differing understandings of the contract that are in play in any given time. They highlight how people accept state intrusions to ensure public safety. However, There are also expectations, as we have seen with Hickox, that freedoms and privacy will not be unduly breached, and that any surveillance processes will be appropriate for the severity of risk, fair, and equitable. These cases also highlight how responses to pandemics are territorialized. As De Maurier argues, to be accepted, these contracts must depend on scientific evidence as well as societal values, including how people live, how society is viewed, the balance of liberty, property, privacy, rights, and individual autonomy with safety, security, and public health.
So whilst considering issues of risk and security during pandemics, it is important to note that human security is actually a contested concept that for scholars such as Buzan constitutes an area of concern rather than a precise condition. Security can be approached as protection from risks, but it's also much more complex than that. Different persons, communities, and societies often have different priorities around risks and insecurities, which can fluctuate across time and place. This means that any social contract for ensuring public security will need to be multifaceted, malleable, and dynamic. It is also important to note that the consequences of current technologies of pandemic risk mitigation, including lockdowns, contact tracing, and checkpoints, can be double-edged. As well as saving lives, these technologies encroach on freedoms and rights, as well as livelihoods. Accordingly, tensions around these technologies are morphing right now in a context of long-standing public unease around what is termed surveillance realism. Surveillance realism is derivative of capitalist realism. It's the pragmatic idea that people understand that a system is problematic, not working, they're not totally happy with it, but they've struggled to imagine an alternative strategy and so on. We are approaching these complexities and tensions from the perspective of a contingent social contract, which is underpinned by consents and obligations in civil society, agreements between parties, notions of contingent equilibrium, and principles of fairness and procedural justice. Early formations of the social contract, although they provide us a way of looking at these things, they're often a little bit too static to engage in real-time crises. As such, Morgadine in 2008 usefully extends the logical social contract idea with his concept of the psychological social contract and focus on how people understand and manage themselves in relation to a social order. According to Morgadine, these negotiations of social structures or formations, institutions, and normative systems constitute a dynamic and active participation in collective life and in the collaboratively constituted and collectively upheld versions of social reality that come to dominate society in any given time. We want to go a little further with this concept in terms of understanding such social formations by drawing on insights from assemblage theory. We actually thought we're talking to a conference through Paris, so why not engage in a little French theory along the way? So assemblage theory offers a useful lens for thinking about dynamic tensions in the security contract and how it coheres and reassembles in everyday life as crises unfold. Central is the idea that the social world does not have a rigid ontology and is comprised of various assemblages that form a social or relationally contingent ontology. Assemblage theory offers an orientation towards how elements of society interrelate with each other as interwoven aspects of larger heterogeneous and transitory mosaics or social formations. As Anderson and colleagues note, an assemblage is both the provisional holding together of a group of entities across differences and a continuous process of movement and transformation as relations and terms change. Elements in an assemblage can include values, conventions, places, objects, information or data, people, groups, material practices, and events. Assemblages are made up of moving elements that shift in and out of primacy in relation to the evolving crisis. Our focus on tensions speaks to the relational coexistence of elements in the often stilted dance of an assemblage. Here, we must keep in mind Deleuze and Penet's proposition that in a multiplicity, what counts are not the terms or the elements, but what there is between. Rather than focusing on the inherent properties of discrete elements like risk or security, the focus shifts to the functions of these elements in the broader social formation and how it impacts other elements and situations. In short, Deleuze's relational philosophy is useful in times like these when situations are rapidly evolving. This is a philosophy that speaks to the interdependent universe that we all live in and its various entanglements. We are interested in how the Psycurity Contract takes shape over time as a social constellation comprised of contingent elements and tensions between various elements or parts. Central is an exploration of public reactions to material practices and heightened security that restricts our freedoms and privacy. As McFarlane 2011 notes, this orientation implies a way of thinking about social, political, economic, or the cultural as a relational processuality of composition and as a methodology attuned to practice, materiality, and emergence. Now, this is a picture. A key part of assemblage theory is that it is often territorialized. Now, we know territories such as ours are also highly contested, and this brings another level of complexity to what we're talking about today. For example, we see a way of thinking about New Zealand on the left that's very much in keeping with the settler society, as opposed to a Māori perspective on the nation, the island nation state which we're in together. So assemblage theory is concerned with processes whereby often contingent elements come together as part of a larger formation. One key aspect of the present assemblage around the Psycurity Contract is what Deleuze and Penet refer to as a geography of relations that reflects what Deleuze and Guattari call the logic of and, rather than either or. According to this logic, one element is not hierarchically absorbed by another, but coexists through connective alliances and tensions with other elements. For example, within the Psycurity Contract, risks are linked to surveillance, rights, and insecurities in dynamic and evolving ways. It is worth re-emphasizing here that just because assemblages are fluent and dynamic social constructs does not mean that they lack material form or historical implications. Our Psycurity Contract is articulated through the permissibility of material acts, such as heightened surveillance practices and border closures that impinge on our freedoms, but which many of us accept, or at least for now, as being necessary to ensure public security and safety. Reflecting the logic of and, tensions in the Psycurity Contract foreground how all elements also retain some independence within the assemblage, within which they form, let's think of it as an orchestra. As these elements move, or for example, a risk gets more pressing, the contract has to morph and new material practices such as social distancing can emerge, whilst other social practices, such as the way we often conduct our everyday lives, are discontinued. As the risk from COVID-19 is also perceived by some to lessen, we also get more breaches in security practices and increased likelihood of a reassemblage of what is tolerable or acceptable in terms of the impositions on freedoms and rights and so on. If material practices such as the lockdown which we've been experiencing in this country do not shift with the public consensus, then the government risks breaching the contract itself and losing the followership of the body politic. Now, the Psycurity Contract has been reassembling throughout our national response to the pandemic, and we'll show some of that today. It took initial shape through the early and clear communication of the risk of COVID-19 and a plan of action that was also in the making, but seemed plausible to a frightened populace. Over time, the contract has become less stable and begun reassembling as dissenting voices have, for example, reasserted the primacy of risks to the economy over those of public health. For Deleuze and Guattari, 2003, assemblages are also, as I mentioned earlier, territorialized and shaped by the contexts within which they come together. A big part of our context is a responsive and humane administration or government. As such, it is important to note that we are speaking to the Psycurity Contract in a particular country whose everyday landscapes are being reshaped, but in ways in keeping with the public good. Contracts in your countries may differ as well as overlapping with ours. This is particularly the case as we learn from each other.
On February the 28th, the first case of COVID-19 was reported in New Zealand, and subsequently a 4-level alert system that you can see on your screen was introduced that set out the various levels of response and the various levels of freedom that New Zealanders could have. On March 25, a state of emergency was declared, and at 11:59 p.m, the nation went into alert level 4 or complete lockdown. The borders had been closed a few days earlier, except for returning residents who were detained in self-isolation or government-managed facilities. As key securitizing agent, the government identified the existential risk of COVID-19 and invoked legislation granting government entities extraordinary powers to prevent any activity that heightened public risk in order to protect the physical, social, and economic health of the country. Implementing a lockdown can be viewed as an act of territorialized governance, of which Hillier and Abraham's 2013 argue, and I'll quote here, requires the stabilization and fixing of certain forms of social interaction in order to maintain social harmony. At this time, we saw the increased use of symbols and mantras such as go early, go hard, and our team of 5 million were employed to promote solidarity and public conformity. As the infected cases went up, so did the perceived risk and public willingness to endure intrusions by the state into their everyday lives. The early assemblage of the contract appeared relatively cohesive, with one major pollster reporting that 87% of respondents supported the state's response to the pandemic. 90% indicated that they were complying with the new restrictions and practices, such as social distancing. This support has been maintained in more recent polls. Such contracts are rarely, if ever, universally accepted. There were also early breaches of the contract. Some people did not accept the severity of risk to health and preferred not to have their freedoms removed. Some breaches also reflect the efforts of people to try and keep their businesses alive, and they continued trading until they were forced to shut down. Breaches also occurred as people sought affordable food not available in their area because more affluent groups were panic buying staple items. What these breaches do signal is that there are multiple risks and multiple insecurities in play in a society that many people must grapple with every day. As the weeks progressed, the rate of COVID-19 cases decreased. Further breaches occurred and people were granted more freedoms. The balance between risk mitigation and security were reassembled. These dynamics reflect Hillier and Abraham's assertion that assemblage boundaries are indeterminate and frequently challenged, transgressed, and/or extended as new connections occur and old ones rupture. A prominent example of reassemblage was the judicial review in Christensen versus the Director of Health 2020. During the most stringent phase of the lockdown period, or level 4, Oliver Christensen returned to New Zealand to be with his terminally ill father and was placed in managed isolation. His father's condition dramatically declined within the quarantine period, and it became evident that his death was imminent. In applying for early quarantine release, Mr. Christensen argued that he showed no signs of COVID-19, his father was being cared for at home by family members, he pledged to observe social distancing and to return to managed isolation within 24 hours of his father's death. Despite these assurances, Mr. Christensen was declined an exemption from quarantine on 3 separate occasions and subsequently took the matter to the High Court. Justice Walker determined that although the Health Act order may have been applied correctly, there were legal grounds for exemption on reasons of compassion, low risk of transmission, and exceptional circumstances. She went on to say, no matter how necessary or justified the COVID-19 response is, decisions must be proportionate to the justified objective of protecting New Zealand, bearing in mind the fundamental civil rights at issue, freedom of movement and of assembly. In her judgment, Walker invokes the heterogeneous elements of risk, security and freedom that are central to the assemblages of the Psycurity Contract, and she raised issues around the power of the state and procedural justice. She highlights the relational processuality of the Psycurity Contract and its material implications. This judgment invariably prompted processes of re-territorialisation, whereby new rules or practices were established. Quick reviews undertaken by our Ministry of Health regarding humanitarian requests for access to dying relatives and processes for making such decisions were reconstituted, and decisions regarding 5 other cases were overturned. So here we can see the tensions between perceived risk, restraints on freedom of association can shift quickly in times of crisis. We can also see how courts can function as an interdependent and independent aspect of the contract, and how tensions within it regarding what is permissible are managed. Rules and regulations hold an assemblage together in dynamic ways and are central to reassemblages. Also relevant are other institutions in civil society, such as the news and social media.
So many of these tensions in the Psycurity Contract are actually being deliberated upon across news and social media platforms, or what Silverstone has usefully referred to as the mediopolis. Now, this is the mediated public domain of contemporary society, or polis, that is also subject to issues of symbolic power and restraints on who gets to participate and on whose terms. It is useful to draw on exemplars from the mediopolis to highlight some of the tensions around what actions are appropriate or permissible at different points in this evolving crisis and the corresponding contract. It is also where the positive and negative implications of security practices and intrusions can be witnessed publicly and renegotiated and made sense of. Now, trust and support in the government response can be a fragile element of a Psycurity Contract, and is being championed and challenged within the mediopolis simultaneously. Here, some lines of argument about appropriate courses of action are also subject to political machinations, and we're 4 months out from an election. This is evident in attempts from some quarters to minimise the risk from COVID-19, question the legality of lockdowns, and call for what we would see as a premature return to what some people perceive to be normal life or normal everyday life. It does seem irresponsible at one level to undermine trust in the government in a time of crisis, but this assemblage is taking shape in an age of partisan politics where some people who are used to basically exercising considerable symbolic power to control the public narrative are attempting to reshape the public narrative and the contestation of ideas around what we do as a nation to meet their own political needs and ends. So let's look at some examples. This news item offers an overt example of the Psycurity Contract in action in relation to issues around surveillance as a technology for risk mitigation. It focuses on the issue of contract tracing. In ordinary times, mass surveillance being proposed would be unacceptable to many citizens and is still contested even in a time of crisis. The item sets out how the Ministry of Health has been working with an intelligence agency, or our GCSB, and private companies on developing what they see as an effective system for contact tracing. The item raises concerns regarding mass surveillance in relation to issues raised by Amnesty International and the Privacy Foundation of New Zealand on how contact tracing might contribute to further intrusions into everyday life and people's privacy. The Law Society and Internet New Zealand are also elements in this assemblage. And they're also cited as emphasising the importance of the government taking the time to consider, and I'll quote here, issues around privacy and security and human rights. Emphasis is also placed on the need to, quote, bring the community along with you, be transparent about what you're proposing, because we're more likely to buy in for any technological solution to actually be successful if people feel they're part of that conversation. The item contains assurances from the Ministry of Health that data collected to track COVID-19 infections would only be used for ensuring public health and would be regularly deleted. Here we see the tension between key stakeholders in the app development, including the government and concerned citizen groups. Also evident are tensions between potential positive security gains from the use of technology and potential negative losses in terms of personal privacy that are implicated in what is permissible under the Psycurity Contract. Now, just to give you an update, the app, I think, was launched yesterday. 90,000 people downloaded it. Downloading the app in New Zealand is voluntary, as is uploading any information. And the app is pretty much a movement diary that people can keep, so that if they're infected, they can upload it, and this will speed up the contact tracing. So we've taken quite a different approach to some other nation states. In the present situation, emphasis has also been placed on a key tension around public health and well-being, economic well-being, sorry. This tension appears central to shifts in the assemblage towards less intrusive interventions into everyday life. Mediated or media deliberations included vested interests such as mall owners who see their livelihoods as being placed at risk by the lockdown. A key complaint seems to be that the government was unnecessarily putting livelihoods in jeopardy by going too hard and locking down the country, and that this was a step too far. Those advocating against the lockdown minimised the risk of COVID-19, pointed to nations such as Sweden who took different approaches, and argued that the lockdown was out of proportion to the problem or the risk, and that life should return to normal immediately. Such contributions, if we can call them that, became particularly pronounced during the period of decision-making around when to come out of lockdown from our level 4 to alert level 3 and then to level 2. In this item, we see an intertextual reference to calls for the government to open up the economy within our borders. And here's a particular quote. The government has been under increasing pressure from the opposition and business groups to reopen the country, with the Employers and Manufacturers Association urging the government to make the move to spark a recovery in the economy. Further challenging the government's response, an opposition politician is cited as saying there's no data to support staying in lockdown, which is actually incorrect. And also that people have already organically moved from level 3 to level 2 themselves. And so we should actually just formalize the shift. Now here we see the intersection of risks that are being framed as competing concerns when in fact they're actually interlinked and interdependent. The argument that the lockdown is no longer necessary was then countered by an epidemiologist who refuted the assertion that the country had already moved to level 2 and proposing that we should actually stay in lockdown a lot longer than the government was likely to do. In doing so, this expert attempts to transcend the framing of risks to public health and the economy as somehow competing. And here's a quote which we think reflects that repositioning. People have lost their livelihoods over this, and we have to just make it worthwhile. And that means keeping our physical distance for a few more weeks until we have a nice clear patch of no infections. And then the big prize of that effort is that we can go back to life almost as normal. As signaled by government efforts to manage this tension, and they have been heavily involved in the conversation, if we open up too early, we risk wasting our effort to eradicate the virus, and we'll have to yo-yo back and forth between lockdowns and more freedom and so forth in our everyday lives. That would be even worse for the economy. We also see key tensions being played out between different actors in trying to balance these tensions between competing risks or risks that are basically interacting with each other. Now, as we noted earlier, the issue of multiple risks affecting different people is important and really central to a lot of what we're talking about today. The Psycurity contract that has assembled around COVID-19 is located in a wider societal and global context of multiple risks, inequities, and insecurities related to the intersections of disadvantage or precarity that are shaped by gender, ethnicity, social class, and so forth. These intersections inhabit the everyday lives of members of the precariat, many of whom have been designated as essential workers during the crisis. Now, you know, these are the people that have to go out and clean buildings and hospitals and malls and other places to mitigate the risk for the rest of us. It can be argued that what we are also witnessing here is how the precariat function as shock absorbers in a crisis. During lockdown, such workers cannot work from home like many of us and have to venture out, placing themselves and their families at increased risk of infection. It can also be argued that the current crisis exacerbates existing insecurities and inequities for the precariat around housing, feeding more people at home because they're all home during the day, and contracting respiratory infections or being more likely to because one is dwelling in overcrowded, cramped, and damp housing. These issues are part of public deliberations and discussions around what we should do as a nation. Now, on another news item, which is the one we've pictured up in front of you, it's reported that the pay of contract cleaners for organisations such as the Auckland City Council was actually cut while they were doing this work and during this period by 20%, down to the value of the government's wage subsidy, which was another practical intervention as part of the assemblage to try and mitigate some of the job losses that are likely to come with an event like this. Now, what happens is with a 20% cut, this actually takes these workers below the legal minimum wage. And this move is possible by organisations such as the Auckland Council, because the cleaners are not, strictly speaking, employers of such large organisations. As is the case in many neoliberalised universities, cleaning services are often contracted out, often to the lowest bidder, and in the process, we contribute to the insecurities faced by these precariat workers. Their reduced income further exacerbates the risks that come with precarious lives, in that they will find it even harder to pay the rent, feed their children, and so forth when they're not even earning the minimum wage. Clearly, news items foreground the unfairness. Several of the news items we've had have really highlighted the unfairness of this situation in such a time and the stress and fear that many of these workers face every day.
Whilst we are on the topic of stakeholder politics in the assemblage, tensions also surfaced around the issue of Indigenous sovereignty and the powers of settler society. These related to several rural tribal groups setting up checkpoints to protect their communities from lockdown breaches coming into the area. And we can see these on the screen, especially at the bottom left-hand side. We might approach this as an example of community up surveillance that raises further tensions. The government took a pragmatic approach to the development of assigning police to work alongside local Māori in these checkpoints, and you can see that in the top left picture, rather than trying to ban the checkpoints and increase conflict between the Crown and Māori. However, what has also surfaced are tensions between people from different Indigenous and settler backgrounds, and there were accusations of separatism and racism. These were covered in items such as those relating to a controversial talkback radio interview between a tribal leader and a Conservative host. Coverage of this issue foregrounds tensions around who has the right to restrict the actions of other citizens and the legality of different surveillance interventions to mitigate the risk of COVID-19. We have approached the Psycurity Contract as a conceptual mosaic that manifests in various ways within everyday settings, such as the picture on your screen, that have also been retextured by the current crisis. We hope you will agree that delivering the explanatory tool of the Psycurity Contract is useful in understanding the tensions surrounding a crisis, associated risks, insecurities, and incursions into the conduct of everyday life. Central are concerns around what is acceptable to the public in mitigating risk to achieve security, and how any balancing of these risks is contingent and open to reassemblage. When risk is perceived to be genuine and pressing, as with the rapidly developing COVID-19 outbreak, then violations of personal freedoms through heightened security measures are more likely to be deemed acceptable. As the situation evolves, additional risks, such as economic security, that may be framed as competing and perhaps more pressing, emerge. Shifting balances in the tension between the risk of the virus and the threat to the economy contribute to the reassemblage of the Psycurity Contract and support for updating the responses. To further understand the dynamic relationship between elements in the assemblage, we might use the metaphor of nervous or stilted dancing. The elements are often in step or balance, and when they get out of step, such as when the government recently initially limited funerals in our level 2 to 10 people, some entities in the public pushed back, and the government readjusted this material practice, and we got back in step together again. With any assemblage, there are unanticipated implications. These have included people having time in lockdown to reassess their situations and whether or not they want to go back to the way things were. Time will tell how such reflections take shape and if there are any lasting change in the way we conduct our everyday lives. In terms of our broader response to the crisis at home, we are now activating our networks in an effort to be useful in our collective response to the pandemic. In this, we are very lucky that we have a humane administration. We have also instigated Project SAFE, as you can see on your screen, an interdisciplinary network to advance the psychology of security through scholarship. We want to come together to improve human security equitably. This means combining resources to create new, responsive ways of capturing what is concerning people at any given time and in any given context, so that responsible governments and international agencies can act on evidence that is reliable, accountable, and ethically defensible. We invite you all to become part of Project SAFE.
Thanks, Veronica, and thanks everybody for taking the time to listen to this point. I'd just add that Project SAFE actually stands for Security Assessment for Everyone. We have a colleague called Stuart Carr who's very good at coming up with these kind of titles for things. And we'll just end it there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Darrin and Veronica. We have now around 25-30 minutes for discussion. We already have quite a few of questions, but I want to say to all participants, if you have any questions, just put in the Q&A section on Zoom. You can just put your questions in, and then I try to bring some of the questions together and I articulate them. I think there is I can already see a certain order in the questions. Some are about your basic concept, psychological contract, and the others are about certain specific theoretical concepts you are working with. And I think we should start with the question about contract, psychological contract. I think your talk brings us in the center of this pandemic and corona crisis. There is something which combines us. And with the term contract and psychological contract, I think you try to grasp it and analyze that. I think that's wonderful. People ask, why contract? So I can read this question. Let me see, where is it? Can you, Peter North is asking, can you further elaborate on the psychological contract? I always wonder about that. Isn't the idea of a contract way too rational for psychological being?
Yeah, I mean, we've used the term contract because when other people have tried to think about these things, that's the term they've used. So when we're thinking about Mugadime and others, and I think what we've tried to do is look at that work and then try and take it in a slightly different direction. We would agree, this isn't totally logical or rational. It's emotive. It morphs in all sorts of ways. Some of it's driven by fear and anxiety and all sorts of emotions. We've just not really focused on those elements in this particular talk, but it is definitely part of the picture. So we take the point. I mean, contract is not a perfect word for this. It is problematic, but it's one that's used in the literature. And when you're launching off from something like this, then it gives us a place to start. We are far more comfortable in thinking about this as an assemblage.
Yeah. Okay, we in a second we go further on with assemblage, but first one more question directly relating to a contract. It is from Barul Banzai. Can psychological contract, which privileges, no, it was one before here. Do you think that adherence to psychological contract depends upon the extent of trust that people have in the government and also the cultural notions around privacy and freedom?
I think we would say that the contract is an assemblage and that trust is part of that. And yes, certainly that there would there's need, and what we've seen in our country is when the government has been very clear and very transparent, the levels of trust seem to be higher in terms of accepting the heightened levels of security, of surveillance that have been seen as our response.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think trust is central and crucial, but I think I agree with Veronica. It's part of the dynamism that's going on. And there are things that the government have been doing to try and manage and heighten that trust. And part of that is like all the official papers around decision-making have been released. So they haven't kept that private. All those memos, emails, official government documents were released to the public. So you can go through them and actually have a look at them and what the conversations were occurring around this decision-making on, do we lock down? Do we go for a Swedish kind of model? What do we do? So that decision-making is now in our public domain. And we would argue that despite some political machinations around dumping that on a Friday and overwhelming journalists with information, it's good to have that stuff in the public domain. And I'm not sure other administrations that we've had would actually release that information, or whether other governments in other places would release it either. Also, we're fully aware that in countries where you have less humane administrations, you're going to have less trust and you're going to have more breaches and less buy-in to the contract.
Our Prime Minister and the Director of Health also at 1 o'clock every day, and it sort of varied a little bit with who the Director of Health was, and the Prime Minister would have a day off a week, but they would have a press conference at 1 o'clock every day, and she made it very clear day after day that all of the information that she had received that day was being recounted to us just a few hours later. So we can see that that conference was a mechanism of trust building and made it, I think, and people talked about watching that conference every day, that there was, you know, clear communication and as a mechanism of building trust.
Yeah, I have one more question concerning the term contract and psychological security contract. I think I understand the phenomena very well. I think I can recognize that, but I still wonder about the term contract. Contract is something where we, you know, where we agree on, and where, and this is something more implicit. So where, and something also collective, a collective agreement between people, which comes, and you are analyzing how this, how it comes together. What are important connections for this agreement we have in different places in connection with the Corona crisis? I understand that. My question is, I wonder still about the term contract. I think it's not so perfect, because we have with contract, we immediately think something we consciously agree, but this, the interesting thing is more what is implicit, and that's why we need this analysis you are doing. And here, my question is, I understand why you say psychological or security contract, but maybe you can elaborate more. Where is the psychological dimension of this implicit agreement? So if we hear your talk, it sounds more, some economical issues, and some people will think, oh, where is the psychological dimension, or why is what you are saying psychological?
I think because it involves people and relationships and the negotiation of those. We've purposely not called it the psychological contract, we've called it the security contract, because for us, psychology includes material practices and actions in the world. It's not just about heads and what we think and that old psychology looking to behavior and so on. I think human psychology is far more dynamic, and you'll know this yourself, Ernst, from your own work on the conduct of everyday life. It includes other forms of interaction, and economics and all that is made by people. Yeah. So these are psychological formations. We know this when you look at, you know, the casino that is the world stock market. It's all based on psychological kind of trust and positive thinking and all the rest of it. And in some parts through this crisis, it's been quite irrational in terms of market going up when we're likely heading into a depression. So we would argue that this is based on a broader understanding of psychology. That isn't just something that occurs with thoughts and heads and small groups. It's about collective meaning making. It's about implicit understandings, what the literary critic Raymond Williams referred to as structures of feeling in a society. And sometimes it's that elusive. And what we're doing is using the term crisis to almost kind of nail down a little bit something that is fluid and dynamic and changing. And that's a tricky thing to do. And we agree that the term crisis contract is not perfect for this. And we need to think about that.
Yeah, and I think we're using it as a lens. We don't think it's something that exists in and of itself, or we're rarefied in any way. We're just using it as a mechanism to talk about all of these assemblages that happen around privacy and freedom and justice and all of those sort of feelings and relationships that people have with each other about what they're prepared to give up, what they're not prepared to give up, what might feel like a good thing to do or not a good thing to do. So I guess, yeah, the emotion, but coupled with these very material practices of not being able to go outside your house or not being able to go to the shops, and how people actually make sense of those.
And it's almost like we've got a strange form of nationalism going on in some ways. And I don't mean that in that kind of warfighting kind of way. I mean that in that way of a sense of ourselves as us. And this was very much cultivated through that term, our team of 5 million. You know, the Prime Minister was very effective early on saying this is up to us and we need to work collectively to do it. And that appeal to the collective, belonging and so on. And when people are facing fear and uncertainty, everyone's a socialist in New Zealand almost at the moment, believing in those economic interventions and government and so on. And it's quite interesting to watch. And we would argue that there's a lot of psychology involved in that. There's leadership. There's all sorts of dimensions within this assemblage that we haven't really had time to really talk about today either.
Yeah, there are more questions, and they go now more in detail with the theoretical concepts you are working with to understand this interconnection or interaction between people. So, and a central term you are using is assemblage, and to understand these connections. And one question is from Morten Nissen. If assemblage means that everything relates to everything and is defined by its relation to everything, how does that theory help discern what matters and why?
It's a very good question. I'm hoping that the person who asked that question actually has an answer to it, because it's quite a tricky one. I personally think everything is interconnected. I think we can see that in Buddhist psychology. We can see it in a range of different understandings. I think as psychologists, we're used to teasing things out into causal relationships and so on, rather than seeing the dynamics, kind of movement between things, where something can be a cause and effect, and an effect and a cause and so on. And so for us, assemblage theory was quite attractive in trying to grapple with tensions between elements that are central to our response to COVID-19. And to, rather than approach it as a kind of causal thing where we, you know, leadership and communication cause this, we think it's far more dynamic and complex than that, and there are far more players involved than that kind of explanation would offer. So for us, in a sense, what we've done is reassembled aspects of assemblage theory in order to apply them to trying to understand what's going on around us. And it just seemed that a theory like that offered the dynamism. But we agree. I mean, we had a lot of conversations about what isn't an assemblage. Is there something that isn't an assemblage? If society's an assemblage and this is an assemblage, does the term become meaningless? These are things that we haven't fully worked through yet.
Yeah. There's one more question about assemblage, and I will read it in a sec. I think one strength of the assemblage concept is it's not only social relationships, but what you mentioned before, the material relationships, that we can include them in a conceptual framework. Now I read this question from David Fryer. Are explanatory notions like assemblage and dispositif easier to read off, respectively, than to be known through fieldwork? Harder on theoretical grounds to do with postmodern approaches to what it is to be known rather than for practical reasons? Have you to come to know the elements which constitutes the security assemblage, and how have you come to know the elements which constitute the security assemblage and the interrelationships? If so, how?
We looked around us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. How?
I think one of the concerns I have about some of those postmodern arguments is you can't do anything. They become more paralyzing for me as quite a practical person. And I think that assemblage theory, or how we might engage with it, there can be practicalities, because to understand these dynamics and to understand how something may be working is an important thing to do. I think we can get into endless conversations about how do we know what we know and what do we know and how, you know, and okay, that's nice, and it kind of involves some mental gymnastics and a lot of work in working through those ideas. But that's not really what we're talking about or trying to do. Like anything one argues, knowledge is always contingent, can always change, and it's always imperfect. So for us, this is just a useful lens for looking and looking around us and trying to make sense of it, but we're not saying it's the truth. We're not saying that this is the way it is, or that we've captured all the elements. There are clearly other elements at play. We haven't really discussed leadership yet. We haven't discussed some of the other dynamics involved here. And we may never know all the elements that are involved in an assemblage. But I'm kind of okay with that.
And I guess we're just trying to theorize the psychology of crisis or COVID-19 and looking at different case studies that have happened in our country and saying, okay, can we apply this theory and how does it work through this case study and does it make sense? And we thought it did.
Yeah, and the other thing is psychologists are very good at looking at elements in minutiae. We're atomists. And so we're into that kind of analytical, philosophical basis. A lot of our work in psychology, whether it's quant or qual, is from that kind of analytic tradition of philosophy. One of the things that's attractive about this theory is it's more continental in its orientation. It's more about processes and emergences and so on. And that's what makes it quite exciting or interesting to us, because we're watching something emerge and unfold in front of us. And it does seem dynamic and changeable and contested along the way. So really what we're looking for within our group is ways that we can engage with crises live. And anyone who's trying to engage with a crisis or a practical situation live knows you can have the best plan in the world and you can have, you know, this is my theory of change, and if I do A, B will happen and then we'll get C. Then you get on the ground and it just doesn't work like that. And then you have to basically adjust and think about how you're engaging with it. So with assemblage, what we get is some concepts and some ideas that really encourage us to think about and engage with process. Yeah. And I think that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. There's one more question concerned with the dynamics of the security contract, and it's from, now this is always a bit jumping, it's from Parul Bansai. Can the security contract, which privileges social distancing and lockdowns in order to mitigate risk at the cost of livelihood, be binding at all? Is it socially just?
I think if it saves lives, it is. I mean, what price? You could be a utilitarian and say a life is worth $19,000, and if it costs more like that, we won't worry about the life because it's a monetary thing. That depends on your politics, your values. I think, yeah.
I'm not sure we would see it as that transactional either.
No.
Yeah.
No. I think the reality for us is if we can succeed through this assemblage of eliminating the virus in our nation state, then that dichotomy between the economy and health really becomes problematic. It's not going to mitigate our economic concerns totally, because of 15% of our economy, I think it is, I'd have to check that, relies on tourism. Well, that's gone. Mm-hmm. So we need to do some other things in order to secure that economic security, and we are moving to that conversation. But by locking down, we've had 2 cases in the last 7 days. You know, so there is something, if we can stick to it and bind ourselves to it for a little bit longer, we have a chance of saving a considerable amount of lives. We've lost 21 people through this. And I think a lot of that has to do with the lockdown and the measures that were taken. But these are impositions on people, and they do transgress rights. And this, imagine being the government and having to make those decisions, to decide to actually lock down an economy and so on. you'd lose a few nights sleep over that, because there are people who are going to be hurt by this. There's also a very legitimate argument that with bankruptcies and business closures and so on and unemployment, we know those things are not good for health. I mean, David is probably is the leading psychologist around unemployment and has been historically. And from his work, we know that unemployment has a major impact on health. Or I think there's evidence there for that. I mean, that may be contested. And so we need to think long term as well. But I personally think locking down when we did was the right thing to do.
Yeah. People are concerned with this concept of contract. And I take one more question related to contract from Gordana Jovanovic, and I read the question. Contract has a historical root. Social contract as the origin of society, but the primary realm in a society is economy. Contract presupposes freedom of parties to sign a contract in this condition fulfilled in the security. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go closer. Is this condition fulfilled in the security contract? It's a question. From that, it would follow that no sanctions should follow because not every citizen has freely signed a contract. Is it not just a logical issue, but also a social political one? How would you comment on that?
Well, the first thing I would say is here we are looking at an element in minutiae again, rather than the relationship between these things. Secondly, the oldest economy is arguably a gift economy. So if we look at Mouse and people like that around gift exchange, look, I think you made the point earlier, Ernst, around implicit, and this isn't about signing agreements and so on, and we really do, maybe we call it the Psycurity agreement or something like this, because I think the concerns around the word contract are concerns that we share. It's just, again, linking to a literature and using a terminology. And we also have had some concerns around it in terms of how it works within capitalist systems and so on. Sorry, Julie. I
was going to say that I guess that what appears that that person asking the question was talking about the logical social contract of Hobbes and etc. And then Mogadom has sort of extended that into the psychological social contract. And then we wanted to take that just that step further. And initially we were really focusing on trade-offs between, or balancing between surveillance and privacy. And then as COVID-19 came along, we actually realized that there was, and that balance or between surveillance and privacy was kind of underpinned by justice, the distributive justice, procedural justice, and transactional interactional justice. And then we sort of, as we started to see COVID-19 and try to make sense of it, we then sort of extended that out further and saw that actually, you know, it's actually a lot about sort of freedoms and freedoms of right and association, as well as privacy, as well as trust, as well as so all of these other things. And that's sort of, I guess, where we came to assemblage theory. So yes, I agree that with a logical social contract, there is this kind of agreement, but we've sort of tried to step it sort of through Mogadom and sort of further through that.
And perhaps it's outgrown the concept of a contract in that process.
It's a useful lens for just sort of, I think, making sense of, you know, and within contracts, there's some idea of balance. And I think that's maybe what we're using as being useful part of using the lens of a contract.
Yeah, there are more questions. And I take now one which brings us a little bit further. And it's from Marco Gemignani from Spain. He's writing, as I suppose all over the world, not only in Spain, we see instances of groups of people who are considered necessary and yet sacrificable, such as hospital cleaners or supermarket cashiers, delivery employees, and so on. At the same time, these people are not recognized publicly for their sacrifice, and their possible disappearance or death will also be unnoticed. Do you think we are experiencing a form of necropolitics here?
I'm not sure. In New Zealand, supermarket workers have been applauded. There have been instances where people are clearly stressed during this, and some people lose their crap or become emotional and abusive towards them. People have actually intervened in those processes. So I'm not sure they haven't been recognised here. I agree with the sentiments of the question, but I think part of the mediated conversation in the polis has been quite interesting, because there have been, I'm someone who's tried to promote issues around the precariat in our public discourse for a long time, and different periods it's possible. We're having a conversation about fairness, equity, wealth sharing, and so on, that I don't think we've really had in the same way before as a country. So in this country, they may be recognised, but we're in a different position to a lot of other countries, and how this thing assembles here is likely to be different to how it assembles in Spain or other countries as well. So we can't really talk to those contexts as easily, I would have thought, because our situation and our process has been quite different.
Yeah.
But we would hate to think that those valuable people are forgotten and their efforts aren't really rewarded. But then again, there's a tension, because here's a classic example. One of the supermarkets gave people an extra payment for working during this and for the risk they faced. When we stepped down from level 4 to 3, the supermarket chain tried to remove that payment, which was recognition of their extra work. There was a public outcry, and the corporation actually reversed the decision as a result of that public outcry. So I think that's an example of there's something interesting going on here around public recognition, that people, who is actually essential to the running of our society and our safety, and it is people like cleaners. Of course, there's been the recognition of the nurses and the doctors and groups such as that, but we've also seen a lot of these other groups being recognised, and this is part of the outrage around the pay cut.
Yeah.
People are saying, these are people coming out. Sorry, Ernst.
Yeah. Time is running. We only have a few minutes back. My suggestion is I take 2 more questions and articulate the 2 questions, and then you can respond to that. One question still refers to the contract. I just read it. Why use the language of business, as a business contract, to explore humanity? By doing so, we privilege business ways of thinking and doing, and reframe our existence through a pragmatic and functional lens. How can we adopt a lens that privileges emancipatory thinking? That's question 1. And then the other question refers to a part of your talk where you talked about how we live our everyday life, and that there's normal or ordinary and extraordinary dimensions in how we live our everyday life. And the question is from Rosa Burg, is there gonna be a normal life again after COVID-19?
Well, let me take a run at it, and then you can have a go. Our first question, we agree. I think we've established through our conversation that we need to rethink the term contract. And I think in engaging with assemblage theory the way we have, we've attempted to move out of that logical social contract. And that's part of what we meant. We called it rigid, but it does carry those assumptions. Mugadime is different and more complex, and we hope that we can add some more nuance to that approach. The other thing is we've actually written about the ordinary and the extraordinary in everyday life and how complex it can get, particularly when, like myself, my primary area of research for a long time has been homelessness. For these people, the extraordinary is the ordinary. That's punctuated with periods of normality. And so there's a totally different way. That's why I think a lot of people are talking about everyday lives. And that's one of the reasons why we also raise the issue that not everyone carries risks equitably, in the sense that some groups like these cleaners are ending up carrying a lot more risk for a lot less reward, if we want to talk about it in those kind of terms.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And returning back to the contract and the language of business, yes, I do agree with that as well. But I think there's also psychological elements around expectations and around, everybody at the beginning of COVID-19, as I'm sure in your countries as well, was incredibly frightened, and there was expectations about how could we be kept safe. How could we keep, especially our older and our vulnerable populations, really safe? What sort of forms of justice would there be to make sure that, you know, that safety was in place? So I guess, yes, it is a language of business, but I think it can be a language of humanity. But maybe again, we'll have to think a lot about that term.
I mean, this is a tentative formulation that we've done in 3 weeks. So, you know, reading some stuff, looking at what's going around us, trying to assemble an argument, and trying to formulate that. So we really do appreciate the questions that we've had, because they're really forcing us to go back and rethink about this. I just made a note to myself, we need to problematize the language of the contract, and we need to bring in the irrational and the emotional aspects of this a little bit more as well as we're thinking about moving it forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Veronica and Darrin. I think this was a wonderful opening of the conference. We went into the issues and the problems of Corona crisis and how we can psychologically think about it and understand things in their connections. And it shows how we as psychologists are struggling, how to understand things in their connections and how to deal with things in a constructive way. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Ernst.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye, everybody.